Welcome, dear listeners, to another spine-tingling episode of our scary stories. I'm your host, lurking in the shadows of your imagination, and tonight, I have an unnerving tale that will make you rethink the innocence of childhood and the security of your home. This is not just a story, it's a descent into an abode where even the walls harbor secrets. So, lock your doors, check your windows, and pull your blanket a little tighter around you. Our story for tonight is called The Babysitter, and it's not for the faint of heart. Sandra gripped the steering wheel tightly as she guided her aging Honda Civic down the mist-covered Marrow Street. Skeletal trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying like shadowy fingers reaching out to snatch her up. The radio murmured an old pop tune, a flimsy reassurance that clashed jarringly with her surroundings. She glanced at the GPS on her phone. "Your destination is ahead on the right," it chirped. A wrought iron gate adorned with twisted, nightmarish sculptures of crows greeted her. It creaked open as she approached, as if begrudgingly granting her entry. She felt a flutter in her stomach, a gnawing apprehension. "This is what you get for chasing the big bucks," she whispered to herself. Driving past the gate, she entered the grounds. Her headlights crawled over the looming facade of the Wren mansion, Victorian, ancient, layered with centuries of paint and enigma. Ivy crept up the sides like veins on an old man's hands. For a split second, she wanted to turn back, but she steeled herself. "I can do this," she muttered. Sandra parked her car and took a deep breath, gathering the tendrils of her courage. She stepped out into the chilly air, gravel crunching beneath her sneakers. The front door creaked open before she could knock. Mr. Wren, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard and sunken eyes, greeted her. "Ah, you must be Sandra," he said, forcing a tight smile. Come in." He looked at his wristwatch as if time were running out and beckoned her inside. The moment Sandra stepped through the door, she felt it. The atmosphere of the house seemed thick, heavy. The entrance hall was grand, with a crystal chandelier that gave off an ethereal glow, but something was off. Flickering lights reflected in odd, unsettling paintings of distorted figures. An antique grandfather clock ticked with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, a cadence out of sync with the world outside. "Listen to Timothy, he knows the house rules," Mr. Wren said abruptly, pulling her from her thoughts. His eyes met hers, filled with a strange, unspoken urgency. "Sure, where is he?" she asked. Mr. Wren pointed towards the living room, where a young boy sat on a leather couch, engrossed in a book. "Timothy, this is Sandra. She'll be looking after you tonight." Timothy looked up, setting his book aside. "Hello," he said, his voice carrying a gravitas that belied his youth. "Hi, Timothy," Sandra replied. His gaze was intense, not like other kids his age, but he looked harmless enough. Short brown hair, blue eyes, freckles. She felt a slight shiver run down her spine. Was it just the cold, or was it the boy's unnerving maturity? "Sandra, I trust you'll be responsible," Mr. Wren interjected, as if he sensed the moment needed breaking. "I have to leave for an emergency meeting. I'll be back in the morning. The numbers for emergency services and my cell are on the fridge. Not that you'll need them," he added quickly. "Of course," Sandra reassured him, forcing a smile. Without another word, Mr. Wren grabbed a coat and a briefcase from a nearby closet. "Remember, listen to Timothy," he emphasized, locking the front door behind him. The bolt clicked into place, echoing through the hallway. She felt as if the walls were closing in, but shook off the feeling. Timothy was watching her closely, as though measuring her capacity to comprehend the weight of the night ahead. Sandra took a deep breath and looked around. Here she was, alone with a child she didn't know, in a house that seemed to pulse with its own dark life force. "So, Timothy," she started cheerfully, "what should we do first?" The boy's eyes met hers. "First," he said, with a solemnity that seemed to sink into the very air around them, "we need to go over the house rules." The chandelier above them flickered as if acknowledging the gravity of his words, casting fleeting shadows on the walls. For a moment, Sandra felt she was standing at the threshold of an abyss, about to plunge into something far deeper and darker than a mere babysitting gig. It was going to be a long night. Sandra followed Timothy into the living room, where an assortment of board games was neatly stacked on an antique wooden coffee table. Plush leather couches framed the area, their deep maroon upholstery a stark contrast to the room's otherwise drab palette. An elaborate rug, adorned with intricate geometric designs, softened the cold hardwood floor. "Would you like to sit?" Timothy asked, his voice tinged with formality as he gestured toward a couch. Sure, Sandra replied, easing into the cushioning. It enveloped her like a cloud, though the comfort it offered did little to assuage her growing sense of unease. Timothy sat opposite her, his posture rigid. About the house rules, he began. They're mostly straightforward. He took a deep breath as if mustering courage for what he was about to say. Rule 1, no going into the basement. It's off limits. Rule 2, all lights must be turned off when leaving a room. Rule 3, no snacks past 9 p.m. Rule 4, no television after 10 p.m. Sandra nodded, taking in each instruction. Seems easy enough, she said, relieved by the boy's relatively normal guidelines. Anything else? Timothy hesitated, his gaze shifting from Sandra to the door leading to the hallway. When he spoke, his voice quivered. Rule 5, he stammered, never, under any circumstances, open the door. Not for anyone, not for anything. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. The floorboards beneath the rug creaked, as if responding to the weight of Timothy's words. Sandra felt her heart skip a beat. She looked at the young boy before her, his face pale, eyes widened, almost as though he was holding back tears. Never open the door. Sandra finally broke the silence, forcing a chuckle to mask her growing apprehension. Is that a game rule or something? Timothy shook his head, his eyes not leaving her face. It's the most important rule. Please promise you'll follow it. The room seemed to close in on her. A faint whisper seemed to emanate from the adjoining dining room, though she couldn't make out the words. The air became thick, making each breath laborious. Okay, Timothy, Sandra said, more to comfort herself than to assure the child. I promise not to open the door. With a sigh, Timothy's shoulders relaxed, and he picked up the box for a board game from the table. How about we play Monopoly? He suggested, attempting to steer the evening back to normalcy. Sounds like fun, Sandra agreed, although her voice lacked enthusiasm. She helped him set up the game, but as they placed their tokens on the go square, her mind couldn't shake off the eeriness of the final rule. Even as they navigated the tiny silver pieces around the board, even as they laughed when one landed in jail and groaned when the other acquired Park Place, a dark thought clouded her mind, what lurked beyond the locked door that made it so forbidden. The laughter and groans soon faded, as did the illusion of a normal night. Sandra felt it acutely. The eyes in the twisted paintings on the wall seemed to watch her every move. The shadows in the corners grew darker, as if gathering substance. The ceiling seemed to lower incrementally with each pass of the second hand on the wall clock. As she contemplated her next move in the game, the sudden sound of a distant doorbell echoed through the house, making her flinch. Timothy's eyes locked onto hers, a mutual recognition of the rule, the warning, and the unspoken dread that now hung in the air between them. The bell rang again. The room went silent for a moment, save for the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that seemed to throb in Sandra's ears. Timothy's eyes, now a shade paler, widened in anxious anticipation. Don't, he whispered, his voice fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. The knock came again, more insistent this time, jolting Sandra's pulse into a frenetic rhythm. She glanced from the door to Timothy, then back to the door. The boy's anxiety was infectious, but she reminded herself she was the adult here. She couldn't let a child's irrational fears govern her actions. With a hesitant step, Sandra rose from the couch, her joints stiffening as if resisting her decision. Timothy's gaze followed her, and he clasped his tiny hands together as though in prayer. Wait, he implored. You don't know. The doorbell rang a third time, cutting him off. Each chime seemed to reverberate through the house, lingering in the air like a phantom. I'm sure it's just your mom coming back for something she forgot, Sandra assured the boy, although her voice quivered with doubt. Even as the words escaped her lips, she sensed they were more for her own benefit than for Timothy's. Her hand met the cold brass doorknob. As she turned it, a chill shot up her arm, making her gasp. It felt as though the house itself was warning her to pull back. But curiosity, tinged with a stubborn refusal to give in to irrational fears, guided her hand to unlock the latch. The door creaked open with a drawn-out groan, revealing Mrs. Wren on the threshold. She looked almost exactly as Sandra remembered, elegant in a silk blouse and pencil skirt, her dark hair immaculately styled. Yet something was off. Her eyes seemed darker, the whites tinged with a color that Sandra couldn't place, and her smile, though polite, was unnervingly rigid. Mrs. Wren, Sandra greeted, her voice tinged with relief and an unsettling sense of deflation. "We weren't expecting you back so soon." Mrs. Wren stepped in, her high heels clicking on the wooden floor in a rhythm that sounded almost like a coded message. "I forgot some documents for work," she said. Her voice was melodious, yet it carried a monotone that made each word seem rehearsed. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Timothy appeared behind Sandra, peering out from behind her leg. His eyes met Mrs. Wren's, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to thicken, as if absorbing the gravity of their locked gazes. "No, not at all," Sandra said, her attention flipping back to her guest. "We were just playing Monopoly." "Ah," Mrs. Wren replied, her eyes still fixed on Timothy. "How delightful." Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The room seemed darker, as though the light were being absorbed into the walls. The air grew heavier, every intake of breath a conscious effort. Timothy clung to her, his little fingers gripping the fabric of her jeans in a desperate hold. "I'll just go fetch my papers," Mrs. Wren announced, her eyes finally breaking contact with Timothy's, as she turned toward the office door. As she moved away, Sandra felt as though an invisible cord was being pulled taut, the tension building with each step Mrs. Wren took. She glanced down at Timothy, who looked up at her with a mix of disbelief and unspoken horror, as if asking, "How could you?" She wanted to reassure him, to say that everything would be fine, but the words stuck in her throat, her tongue heavy. All she could hear was the insidious clicking of Mrs. Wren's heels, a sound that now echoed in her mind like a grim drumbeat heralding unknown terrors. Mrs. Wren's heels clicked with a strange deliberation as she moved through the home. She paused before the family photos on the mantelpiece, her gloved fingers tracing the contours of the frames with an unsettling slowness. Sandra felt each tick of the clock like a heartbeat, a mounting drumroll that made her want to scream, to shatter the oppressive silence. "Your home is lovely," Sandra forced out, the words leaving her mouth like reluctant soldiers going to war. She watched as Mrs. Wren inhaled deeply, as if savoring the scent of the air. It was an act so profoundly odd that it twisted Sandra's gut into painful coils. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Wren replied. Her eyes flicked over to Sandra, and for a fleeting second, a serpent-like glint shimmered within them, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough. Family is what makes a home, after all. Timothy was nowhere to be seen. He had retreated into some hiding place, blending into the shadows as if he were a part of them. His absence intensified Sandra's sense of impending doom. A sudden cold descended upon the room, wrapping around Sandra like a shroud. She hugged herself instinctively, her arms bristling with goosebumps. Her eyes widened as she saw it. The framed family portrait on the wall was lifting, levitating a solid inch off its nail. A silent scream lodged in her throat. This was impossible, unnatural, but her eyes couldn't deny what they were seeing. Mrs. Wren turned and began to walk toward the hallway, as though pulled by some magnetic force. Her pace quickened, and each step felt like a countdown, every click of her heels a taunt. Sandra's dread deepened into something feral, primal. Instinct overcame her. She bolted to the kitchen, snatching her phone from the countertop. She punched in 911, her fingers trembling so violently she missed the numbers twice. Mrs. Wren's voice echoed from the hallway. "Is everything all right, Sandra? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sandra's phone slipped from her grip, clattering onto the floor. She was paralyzed, held captive by the voice that was both Mrs. Wren's and something else, something otherworldly. The lights flickered, once, twice, then steadied into a dim glow, casting long twisted shadows like gnarled fingers stretching across the walls. Objects on the bookshelves, a vase, books, a globe, started to rise, hovering in the air as if suspended by invisible strings. Mrs. Wren reappeared in the doorway, her silhouette backlit in a hazy glow. Her eyes fixed on Sandra with a gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. "You shouldn't have opened the door," she said, and the walls themselves seemed to shudder at her words. Sandra felt the world tilting, her senses blurring. The levitating objects dropped with a crash, shattering the trance. She needed to find Timothy. She needed to get out. But most of all, she needed to know what stood before her, wearing the skin of Mrs. Wren like a grotesque mask. Fear, raw and untamed, surged through her veins. Mrs. Wren, or whatever she was, had breached the walls of the home, turning sanctuary into a house of horrors. With a feeling akin to drowning, Sandra realized the evening had only just begun, and she was helplessly ensnared in a web spun from the threads of her own disbelief. Sandra stumbled into the den, her thoughts swirling like a storm, each one more chaotic than the last. She couldn't fathom what was happening. She felt like a marionette tangled in the malevolent strings of this house and its unnatural intruder. The air was thick with the stench of mold and damp earth, as though the house were decaying in real time. Just then, Timothy emerged from a shadowed corner. His eyes were red, as if he'd been crying, but they were filled with a fierce determination that took Sandra aback. "Sandra, we don't have much time," he whispered urgently, his voice tinged with a gravity that no child his age should possess. "What is going on, Timothy? Who or what is that woman?" Timothy looked her in the eyes, and the weight of years seemed to hang in his gaze. "That's not my mother. My real mother died years ago." Sandra felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart pounding in her ears. "What are you saying?" "That thing is a shapeshifter. It feeds on fear. The more scared you are, the stronger it gets. That's why we have rules, why you should never have opened the door." Her mouth felt dry, her tongue like sandpaper. She knew she was teetering on the edge of hysteria, but Timothy's words acted as a grounding force. As terrifying as the truth was, understanding brought a sliver of empowerment. "How do we get rid of it?" Timothy stepped closer and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's a way, but it's risky. My dad keeps an heirloom, a silver locket that belonged to my real mom. It has the power to banish the entity, but you have to be close to it. And you can't show any fear, not a shred, or it won't work." "Where is this locket?" "In a hidden compartment behind the bookshelf in my dad's study. You have to press on the spine of the book titled Paradise Lost. It will reveal the compartment." Sandra felt a tangle of emotions, desperation, dread, but also a newfound resolve. The locket was her only chance, their only chance. "Let's go, Timothy. Lead the way." Together, they stepped into the hallway, its walls seeming to close in like the jaws of some monstrous creature. Yet, they moved with a shared purpose, an alliance forged in the crucible of their harrowing night. The air grew colder as they approached the study, each step an act of defiance against the malevolent force that had violated the sanctuary of their home. When they reached the door, Sandra hesitated. This was the crucible, the moment when myths were shattered and heroes were made, or broken. She pressed the spine of Paradise Lost, and the bookshelf shuddered before sliding to the side, revealing a dark compartment. There it was, the silver locket, resting on a velvet cushion as though it were some royal artifact. Timothy handed it to her. "You need to open the locket and speak my real mom's name, Eleanor. Say it with conviction, with belief." Sandra clutched the locket, feeling its cold weight in her palm. She had been given the weapon, the knowledge, the guide. Now all she had to do was face the darkness, and in doing so, reclaim the light. But first, she had to find the shapeshifter wearing the face of Mrs. Wren. And time was running out. Armed with the locket and a modicum of hope, Sandra and Timothy retraced their steps through the maze-like hallway, its oppressive walls imbued with a malevolent energy that seemed to track their every move. The atmosphere was thick, making each inhalation a laborious effort. A once grand chandelier hung above them like an enormous spider, the light it emitted growing increasingly murky. As they moved closer to the living room where they had last seen the entity, Sandra's skin began to prickle, as if unseen fingers danced along her spine. They found it there, still in the guise of Mrs. Wren, its back to them as it caressed the surface of framed family photographs. A cold draft emanated from the entity, turning the room into a frigid cocoon of menace. When it spoke, the voice was a grotesque parody of maternal warmth. "Sandra, Timothy, what took you so long?" In that moment, the entity shifted, its form unraveling into a vile tapestry of darkness and distorted shapes. This abomination was an affront to nature, a horror dredged up from the pits of some eldritch nightmare. Its true form was a writhing, shadowy mass, intermittently revealing eyes that were blacker than the darkest night, teeth that were more like shards of glass. Timothy screamed, clutching his leg as a floating lamp hurtled towards him, cutting through his skin. Sandra felt her resolve waver for a moment too long. The entity roared, a sound that defied description, and a hailstorm of household items erupted into the air, transforming into deadly projectiles. A book whizzed past Sandra's head, its pages ablaze. Gathering every ounce of courage, she flung open the locket and screamed, "Eleanor." The word hung in the air, resonating with the silver of the locket, vibrating in a frequency that seemed to slice through the cacophony. The entity convulsed, its mass imploding as if sucked into a void. Its screams reached a fever pitch, and then it was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. Panting, Sandra rushed over to Timothy. His face was ashen, but his eyes glinted with relief and, perhaps, a new layer of maturity that came from facing unimaginable horrors. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice quivering. "It's over," she whispered, her eyes misty. She looked at the young boy, her protector and guide in this nightmarish odyssey, and felt a swelling tide of emotion. Then she looked around at the living room, a war zone littered with the detritus of their battle. The walls seemed to retreat, as though the house itself were exhaling, releasing them from its malevolent grasp. As they stepped out into the pre-dawn light, the fresh air felt like a baptism. They had survived, but the cost was high. Sandra knew she was forever changed, her eyes opened to realms of darkness she never knew existed. She handed the locket back to Timothy. "Keep it safe," she said, her voice tinged with a gravity that matched his own. "We will," Timothy assured her, gripping the locket like a talisman that could ward off the demons they both knew were all too real. With a final glance at the house on Marrow Street, a place she knew she would never return to, Sandra walked away. She felt the weight of her experience settle deep within her, a burden and a revelation she would carry for the rest of her days. As she moved further from the house, she felt both lighter and immeasurably heavier, a paradox that encapsulated the ordeal she had lived through. Sandra knew she had faced the abyss, stared down unimaginable terror, and emerged on the other side. But she also knew that some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed. And so, we closed the doors of the Wren Mansion. But as you heard, some doors can never truly be sealed. Thank you for embarking on this nightmarish journey with us tonight. Do you dare return for more? If you do, we'll be here, hiding in the dark corners of your room, whispering new tales into the night air. Until then, remember, not all monsters lurk under the bed. Some are invited right through the front door. This is our Scary Stories signing off for tonight.